Book 9, chapters 9 and 10 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anne Boulay. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2, by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 9, chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9. How Amaziah made an expedition against the Edomites and Amalekites and conquered them. But when he afterwards made war against Joash, he was beaten and not long after was slain. And Uzziah succeeded in the government. Now in the 2nd year of the reign of Joash over Israel, Amaziah reigned over the tribe of Judah in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jehoaddan, who was born in Jerusalem. He was exceedingly careful of doing what was right, and this when he was very young. But when he came to the management of affairs and to the government, he resolved that he ought first of all to avenge his father Jehoash, and to punish those his friends that had laid violent hands upon him. So he seized upon them all, and put them to death. Yet did he execute no severity on their children, but acted therein according to the laws of Moses, who did not think it just to punish children for the sins of their fathers. After this he chose him an army out of the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, of such as were in the flower of their age, and about 20 years old. And when he had collected about 300,000 of them together, he set captains of hundreds over them. He also sent to the king of Israel, and hired 100,000 of his soldiers for 100 talents of silver, for he had resolved to make an expedition against the nations of the Amalekites, and Edomites, and Gebalites. But as he was preparing for his expedition, and ready to go out to the war, a prophet gave him counsel to dismiss the army of the Israelites, because they were bad men, and because God foretold that he should be beaten, if he made use of them as auxiliaries, but that he should overcome his enemies, though he had but a few soldiers, when it so pleased God. And when the king grudged at his having already paid the hire of the Israelites, the prophet exhorted him to do what God would have him, because he should thereby obtain much wealth from God. So he dismissed them, and said that he still freely gave them their pay, and went himself with his own army, and made war with the nations before mentioned. And when he had beaten them in battle, he slew of them 10,000, and took as many prisoners alive, whom he brought to the great rock which is in Arabia, and threw them down from it headlong. He also brought away a great deal of prey and vast riches from those nations. But while Amaziah was engaged in this expedition, those Israelites whom he had hired, and then dismissed, were very uneasy at it, and taking their dismission as an affront, as supposing that this would not have been done to them but out of contempt, they fell upon his kingdom, and proceeded to spoil the country as far as Beth-horon, and took much cattle, and slew 3,000 men. Now upon the victory which Amaziah had gotten, and the great acts he had done, he was puffed up, and began to overlook God, who had given him the victory, and proceeded to worship the gods he had brought out of the country of the Amalekites. So a prophet came to him and said, that he wondered how he could esteem these to be gods, who had been of no advantage to their own people who paid them honors, nor had delivered them from his hands, but had overlooked the destruction of many of them, and had suffered themselves to be carried captive, for that they had been carried to Jerusalem in the same manner as any one might have taken some of the enemy alive, and led them thither. This reproof provoked the king to anger, and he commanded the prophet to hold his peace, and threatened to punish him if he meddled with his conduct. So he replied, that he should indeed hold his peace, but foretold withal, that God would not overlook his attempts for innovation. But Amaziah was not able to contain himself under this prosperity which God had given him, although he had affronted God thereupon. But in a vein of insolence he wrote to Joash, the king of Israel, and commanded that he and all his people should be obedient to him, as they had formerly been obedient to his progenitors, David and Solomon. And he let him know that if he would not be so wise as to do what he commanded him, he must fight for his dominion. To which message Joash returned this answer in writing: King Joash to King Amaziah, there was a vastly tall cypress tree in Mount Lebanon, as also a thistle. This thistle sent to the cypress tree, to give the cypress tree's daughter in marriage to the thistle's son. But as the thistle was saying this, there came a wild beast, and trod upon the thistle. And this may be a lesson to thee, not to be so ambitious, and to have a care, lest upon thy good success in the fight against the Amalekites thou growest so proud, as to bring dangers upon thyself and upon thy kingdom. When Amaziah had read this letter, he was more eager upon this expedition, which, I suppose, was by the impulse of God, that he might be punished for his offense against him. But as soon as he led out his army against Joash, they were going to join battle with him, there came on such a fear and consternation upon the army of Amaziah, as God, when he is displeased, sends upon men, and discomfits them, even before they came to a close fight. Now it happened, that as they were scattered about by the terror that was upon them, Amaziah was left alone, and was taken prisoner by the enemy. Whereupon Joash threatened to kill him, unless he would persuade the people of Jerusalem to open their gates to him, and receive him and his army into the city. Accordingly Amaziah was so distressed, and in such fear of his life, that he made his enemy to be received into the city. So Joash overthrew a part of the wall, of the length of 400 cubits, and drove his chariot through the breach into Jerusalem, and led Amaziah captive along with him, by which means he became master of Jerusalem, and took away the treasures of God, and carried off all the gold and silver that was in the king's palace, and then freed the king from the captivity, and returned to Samaria. Now these things happened to the people of Jerusalem in the 14th year of the reign of Amaziah, who after this had a conspiracy made against him by his friends, and fled to the city of Lachish, and was there slain by the conspirators, who sent men thither to kill him. So they took up his dead body, and carried it to Jerusalem, and made a royal funeral for him. This was the end of the life of Amaziah, because of his innovations in religion, and his contempt of God, when he had lived 54 years, and had reigned 29. He was succeeded by his son, whose name was Uzziah. CHAPTER 10. Concerning Jeroboam king of Israel, and Jonah the prophet, and how after the death of Jeroboam his son Zechariah took the government. How Uzziah king of Jerusalem subdued the nations that were round about him, and what befell him when he attempted to offer incense to God. In the 15th year of the reign of Amaziah, Jeroboam the son of Joash reigned over Israel in Samaria 40 years. This king was guilty of tumuli against God, and became very wicked in worshipping of idols, and in many undertakings that were absurd and foreign. He was also the cause of 10,000 misfortunes to the people of Israel. Now one Jonah, a prophet, foretold to him that he should make war with the Syrians, and conquer their army, and enlarge the bounds of his kingdom on the northern parts to the city Hamath, and on the southern to the lake Asphaltiris. For the bounds of the Canaanites originally were these, as Joshua their general had determined them. So Jeroboam made an expedition against the Syrians, and overran all their country, as Jonah had foretold. Now I cannot but think it necessary for me, who have promised to give an accurate account of our affairs, to describe the actions of this prophet, so far as I have found them written down in the Hebrew books. Jonah had been commanded by God to go to the kingdom of Nineveh, and when he was there, to publish it in that city, how it should lose the dominion it had over the nations. But he went not, out of fear. Nay, he ran away from God to the city of Joppa, and finding a ship there, he went into it, and sailed to Tarsus in Cilicia. And upon the rise of a most terrible storm, which was so great that the ship was in danger of sinking, the mariners, the master, and the pilot himself made prayers and vows, in case they escaped the sea. But Jonah lay still and covered in the ship, without imitating anything that the others did. But as the waves grew greater and the sea became more violent by the winds, they suspected, as is usual in such cases, that some one of their persons that sailed with them was the occasion of this storm, and agreed to discover by lot which of them it was. When they had cast lots, the lot fell upon the prophet. And when they asked him whence he came, and what he had done, he replied, that he was a Hebrew by nation and a prophet of Almighty God. And he persuaded them to cast him into the sea, if they would escape the danger they were in, for that he was the occasion of the storm which was upon them. Now at the first they durst not do so, as esteeming it a wicked thing to cast a man who was a stranger, and who had committed his life to them, into such a manifest perdition. But at last, when their fortune overbore them, and the ship was just going to be drowned, and when they were animated to do it by the prophet himself, and by the fear concerning their own safety, they cast him into the sea, upon which the sea became calm. It is also reported that Jonah was swallowed down by a whale, and that when he had been there 3 days and as many nights, he was vomited out upon the Euxine Sea, and this alive, and without any hurt upon his body. And there, on his prayer to God, he obtained pardon for his sins, and went to the city of Nineveh, where he stood so as to be heard, and preached, that in a very little time they should lose the dominion of Asia. And when he had published this, he returned. Now I have given this account about him, as I found it written in our books. When Jeroboam the king had passed his life in great happiness, and had ruled 40 years, he died, and was buried in Samaria, and his son Zechariah took the kingdom. After the same manner did Uzziah, the son of Amaziah, begin to reign over the 2 tribes in Jerusalem, in the 14th year of the reign of Jeroboam. He was born of Jecholiah his mother, who was a citizen of Jerusalem. He was a good man, and by nature righteous and magnanimous, and very laborious in taking care of the affairs of his kingdom. He made an expedition also against the Philistines, and overcame them in battle, and took the cities of Gath and Jabneh, and broke down their walls, after which expedition he assaulted those Arabs that adjoined to Egypt. He also built a city upon the Red Sea, and put a garrison into it. He, after this, overthrew the Ammonites, and appointed that they should pay tribute. He also overcame all the countries as far as the bounds of Egypt, and then began to take care of Jerusalem itself for the rest of his life. For he rebuilt and repaired all those parts of the wall which had either fallen down by length of time, or by the carelessness of the kings, his predecessors, as well as all that part which had been thrown down by the king of Israel, when he took his father Amaziah prisoner, and entered with him into the city. Moreover, he built a great many towers, of 150 cubits high, and built walled towns in desert places, and put garrisons into them, and dug many channels for conveyance of water. He also had many beasts for labor, and an immense number of cattle, for his country was fit for pasturage. He was also given to husbandry, and took care to cultivate the ground, and planted it with all sorts of plants, and sowed it with all sorts of seeds. He had also about him an army composed of chosen men, in number 370,000, who were governed by general officers and captains of thousands, who were men of valor, and of unconquerable strength, in number 2,000. He also divided his whole army into bands, and armed them, giving every one a sword, with brazen bucklers and breastplates, with bows and slings. And besides these, he made for them many engines of war for besieging of cities, such as cast stones and darts, with grapplers and other instruments of that sort. While Uzziah was in this state, and making preparation for fatuity, he was corrupted in his mind by pride, and became insolent, and this on account of that abundance which he had of things that will soon perish, and despised that power which is of eternal duration, which consisted in piety towards God, and in observing the laws. So he fell by occasion of the good success of his affairs, and was carried headlong into those sins of his father, which the splendor of that prosperity he enjoyed, and the glorious actions he had done, led him into, while he was not able to govern himself well about them. Accordingly, when a remarkable day was come, and a general festival was to be celebrated, he put on the holy garment, and went into the temple to offer incense to God upon the golden altar, which he was prohibited to do by Azariah the high priest, who had 80 priests with him, and who told him that it was not lawful for him to offer sacrifice, and that none besides the posterity of Aaron were permitted to do so. And when they cried out that he must go out of the temple and not transgress against God, he was wroth at them, and threatened to kill them, unless they would hold their peace. In the meantime a great earthquake shook the ground, and a rent was made in the temple, and the bright rays of the sun shone through it, and fell upon the king's face, insomuch that the leprosy seized upon him immediately. And before the city, at a place called Eroge, half the mountain fell off from the rest on the west, and rolled itself 4 furlongs, and stood still at the east mountain, till the roads, as well as the king's gardens, were spoiled by the obstruction. Now as soon as the priests saw that the king's face was infected with the leprosy, they told him of the calamity he was under, and commanded that he should go out of the city as a polluted person. Hereupon he was so confounded at the sad distemper, and sensible that he was not at liberty to contradict, that he did as he was commanded, and underwent this miserable and terrible punishment for an intention beyond what befitted a man to have, and for that impiety against God which was implied therein. So he abode out of the city for some time, and lived a private life, while his son Jotham took the government. After which he died with grief and anxiety at what had happened to him, when he had lived 68 years, and reigned of them 52, and was buried by himself in his own gardens. End of Book 9, chapters 9 and 10.